In the summer months of 1944, something extraordinary unfolded across the roads and highways of France that would forever change how military forces conceived of supply operations and logistics management. What began as a crisis born from unexpected success transformed into one of the most remarkable demonstrations of industrial capacity and organizational brilliance in military history. The American armies, having finally burst free from their Normandy beachhead, found themselves racing across French territory at speeds that outpaced their ability to keep themselves supplied through conventional means. The solution that emerged from this desperate situation would become the stuff of legend, an operation that German military observers could scarcely believe was possible, and which proved that modern warfare had evolved into something far beyond mere battlefield tactics and combat prowess. When Allied forces stormed ashore on the Normandy beaches on that fateful June morning in 1944, they brought with them not merely soldiers and weapons, but an unprecedented tide of vehicles, equipment, and material that staggered the imagination. The initial assault wave consisted of approximately 156,000 troops, supported by an armada of nearly 7,000 vessels of various types, from massive battleships to small landing craft. This massive undertaking represented months of meticulous planning and preparation, but the execution phase brought challenges that no amount of planning could fully anticipate. By the time June drew to a close, the Allies had managed to unload roughly 170,000 vehicles through a combination of the temporary Mulberry harbours and direct beach landings. These artificial ports, which had been constructed in Britain and then laboriously towed across the English Channel, performed far better than many had dared hope, processing 7.5 million gallons of fuel and 500,000 tons of various supplies even as combat operations continued to rage inland. The breakout from the Norman bocage country, however, proved to be a far more difficult and costly undertaking than Allied planners had anticipated when they drafted their invasion plans. For nearly 2 full months following the initial landings, the attacking forces found themselves bottled up in a relatively small beachhead that measured only about 50 miles in width and perhaps 20 miles in depth at its furthest extent. The German defenders, despite being cut off from significant reinforcement and under constant air attack, had managed to create a formidable defensive network that exploited every advantage offered by the distinctive Norman landscape with its ancient hedgerows, sunken roads, and small fields. The fighting during this period resembled nothing so much as the grinding attritional warfare that had characterized the Western Front during the First World War, with gains measured in yards rather than miles and casualties mounting steadily on both sides. Everything changed when Operation Cobra commenced on the 25th of July. Following an absolutely massive aerial bombardment that saw Allied air forces drop thousands of tons of high explosives on German positions west of St. Lo, American ground forces finally managed to punch through the German defensive lines and burst into the more open country beyond. The subsequent advance occurred at a pace that surprised even the most optimistic Allied commanders, who had been conditioned by weeks of slow progress to expect continued resistance at every turn. General George Patton's Third Army became operational on the first day of August and immediately began the kind of rapid, aggressive advance that would come to characterize American operations during the pursuit across France. Within just a few weeks, elements of Patton's command were covering 50 to 75 miles per week on average, with some periods seeing advances of 80 miles or more in a single 7-day span. By mid-August, forward elements of the Third Army had reached the Seine River, placing them more than 150 miles from the Normandy beaches where they had received their supplies just weeks earlier. This stunning operational success, however, brought with it an unprecedented logistics crisis that threatened to bring the entire advance to a grinding halt. The same Allied bombing campaign that had so effectively isolated the Normandy battlefield from German reinforcements before the invasion had also thoroughly destroyed much of France's railway infrastructure. The French rail system, once among Europe's finest, lay in ruins across vast stretches of the country, its tracks torn up, its bridges demolished, its marshalling yards cratered by bombs. Without functioning railways, the Allies found themselves unable to move supplies forward using traditional methods that had sustained armies for decades. The mathematics of the situation were brutal and unforgiving. Each division actively engaged in combat operations required somewhere between 700 and 750 tons of supplies every single day to maintain effectiveness. With 28 Allied divisions advancing across France by late August, the total daily requirement exceeded 20,000 tons. Patton's armoured divisions alone consumed approximately 400,000 gallons of gasoline each day during active offensive operations, a staggering figure that would have been unimaginable to military planners of earlier eras. The fundamental problem centred on distance and the tyranny of geometry. Every truck that carried supplies from the Normandy beaches to forward units had to make a complete round trip back to the supply dumps before it could deliver another load. As the front lines pushed steadily eastward, the time required for these round trips increased dramatically and inevitably. A single truck delivering supplies 200 miles from Normandy needed more than 50 hours to complete its full cycle from loading to delivery to return. That same truck could make 2 complete deliveries per day when the front had been only 50 miles distant. By August 20th, American armies were experiencing critical shortages of both fuel and ammunition that genuinely threatened to halt offensive operations entirely. Forward units were literally running out of gasoline within sight of retreating German columns, watching helplessly as enemy forces that they could have destroyed simply disappeared to the east because American tanks and trucks had empty fuel tanks. The rapid advance that had characterized August operations was about to grind to a complete stop, not because of German resistance, which had largely collapsed, but because supply trucks simply could not keep pace with the speed of the advance. Something had to be done, and it had to be done immediately if the momentum was to be maintained. In a frantic planning session that stretched across 36 hours beginning on August 23rd, officers from the Transportation Corps developed what would become one of the most famous logistics operations in military history. Their concept was simultaneously simple and audacious: create dedicated express routes using parallel one-way highways reserved exclusively for military supply traffic, operating continuously around the clock without pause. The system would bear the name Red Ball Express, terminology borrowed from late 19th century American railroad practices. Beginning around 1892, the Santa Fe Railroad had begun marking priority freight cars containing perishable goods with red circular markers, and these trains received absolute right-of-way over all other traffic on the network. The term had become standard throughout American railroading to designate express shipping of critical materials. During the build-up to the Normandy invasion, a logistics system in England had adopted the name Red Ball Express for rushing supplies to southern ports, and Transportation Corps planners now appropriated that designation for their new emergency operation. Command of organising this massive undertaking fell to Colonel Lorin Albert Ayers, an officer whose aggressive leadership style had earned him the nickname Little Patton among his subordinates. Ayers faced the daunting challenge of assembling sufficient trucks and personnel to sustain operations on a scale never before attempted in military history. His requirements were staggering: approximately 6,000 vehicles, 12,000 drivers working in 2-man teams to maintain continuous operations, mechanics sufficient to keep the fleet operational, and traffic control personnel to manage what would become the busiest highway network in the world. Establishing route systems capable of handling continuous traffic without creating massive gridlock added another layer of complexity to an already difficult undertaking. The trucks themselves, fortunately, were readily available in the quantities required. General Motors had produced 562,000 CCKW trucks between 1941 and 1945, making the 2.5-ton GMC the second most numerous American military vehicle after the ubiquitous Jeep. These trucks, which soldiers universally nicknamed either Jimmy or Deuce and a Half, featured 6-wheel drive systems, GMC inline 6-cylinder engines producing 91 horsepower, and Warner 5-speed transmissions equipped with overdrive. Under ideal conditions, they could carry 2.5 tons off-road or as much as 5 tons on improved highway surfaces. The complete standardization of the CCKW represented a fundamental advantage over German logistics capabilities that cannot be overstated. Every single truck was identical, built to precisely the same specifications using the same components throughout. Any mechanic could service any truck in the fleet without special training. Any driver could operate any vehicle without familiarization, and spare parts fit every truck identically. This level of industrial standardization, which Americans took entirely for granted as a normal aspect of manufacturing, exceeded German capabilities by several orders of magnitude. Germany had entered the war with more than 150 different truck models in military service simultaneously, each requiring unique spare parts, specially trained mechanics, and specific maintenance procedures. This fragmentation created continuous logistics nightmares, as German units found themselves with immobilized vehicles awaiting parts that would never arrive because the manufacturer had ceased operations or shifted to different production. Finding sufficient drivers to operate the trucks proved considerably more challenging than securing the vehicles themselves. Heirs needed 23,000 men willing to drive continuously for extended periods under demanding and often dangerous conditions. The Army's solution to this manpower requirement reflected the racial realities of 1940s America in ways that would be both shameful and ultimately inspiring. Approximately 3/4 of Red Ball Express drivers would be African American soldiers serving in a still segregated military. The American Armed Forces in 1944 remained strictly segregated along racial lines, with military leadership largely holding to the belief that African American soldiers were unsuitable for combat roles. This belief, rooted entirely in racism rather than any factual basis, meant that most black soldiers found themselves relegated to service and support units performing the unglamorous but absolutely essential work of moving supplies, maintaining equipment, and handling all the logistical tasks that sustained combat operations. These soldiers, denied combat roles not because of ability or courage, but purely because of their skin color, would prove their capabilities under conditions as demanding and dangerous as any faced by frontline combat troops. Most Red Ball drivers were under 24 years of age, and many had never driven trucks before their military service. They came from every region of America, from crowded urban neighborhoods to isolated rural farms, united by a determination to contribute to victory despite facing systematic discrimination both at home and within the military structure that they served. Operations began on August 25th with 67 truck companies commanding 3,558 trucks, moving 1,482 tons of supplies on that first day. The initial route stretched from Saint-Lô to Chartres, approximately 125 miles of French highway. Within just 4 days, operations had expanded dramatically to include 132 truck companies operating 5,900 vehicles simultaneously. The system created a continuous loop of traffic unlike anything previously attempted in military logistics history. 2 parallel highways were commandeered for exclusive military use between Normandy and the forward supply depots. The northern route carried loaded trucks eastward toward the front lines, while the southern route brought empty vehicles back westward to Normandy for reloading. All civilian traffic was absolutely prohibited from these routes, and military vehicles not assigned to Red Ball convoys were similarly barred from using these dedicated highways. Military police from the 793rd Military Police Battalion operated continuously at every major intersection along the routes, recording convoy movements, providing directions to drivers, ensuring priority access at all times, and maintaining the operational discipline necessary to keep traffic flowing smoothly. The 793rd's distinctive unit insignia featured 2 red balls positioned on a diagonal yellow line against a green background, commemorating their red ball service for the remainder of their existence as a unit. Every truck participating in the operation displayed red balls painted prominently on both sides and on the front radiator grille, ensuring instant visual identification. Additional markings indicated each truck's position within its convoy, its parent unit, and the type of cargo it carried. These visual identification systems allowed traffic controllers to manage the flow of thousands of vehicles and identify potential problems quickly without the need to stop convoys for detailed inspection. The official operational requirements were extraordinarily demanding and pushed both men and machines to their absolute limits. Regulations called for convoys of 5 or more trucks traveling 60 feet apart at speeds of 25 miles per hour, escorted by jeeps positioned at the front and rear of each formation. Trucks were supposed to stop for 10-minute rest breaks every hour of operation, and night driving utilized special cat-eye blackout lights that provided minimal illumination while reducing visibility to enemy aircraft that might be operating overhead. In actual practice, however, these regulations were frequently ignored or modified based on operational necessity and driver judgment. Individual trucks often departed Cherbourg immediately after loading rather than waiting for full convoys to assemble, as every minute counted when forward units were desperate for supplies. Drivers routinely disabled the engine governors that limited top speed to 45 miles per hour, with trucks frequently exceeding 60 miles per hour on straightaways when road conditions permitted. Rest breaks got skipped when drivers felt capable of continuing, as the mission's urgency overrode safety regulations and official procedures. Drivers pushed themselves and their vehicles to maintain the flow of supplies, regardless of the toll this took on their bodies and equipment. The round trip from Cherbourg to Chartres and back covered approximately 250 miles and officially required 54 hours to complete according to planning estimates. Drivers worked in two-man teams, alternating between driving and attempting to sleep in the truck cab while their partner took the wheel. In theory, this arrangement ensured that each driver received adequate rest between driving shifts. In reality, road conditions damaged by combat and weather, mechanical breakdowns that occurred with depressing frequency, and the relentless operational pressures meant that drivers often went for days with minimal sleep, sustained by nothing more than determination and coffee. Private James Ruckert, a 19-year-old driver from Maple Heights, Ohio, later described his experiences in interviews preserved by the Veterans History Project, recalling the disturbing sights along the highways. Dead bodies and dead horses littered the roads after bombing runs, he remembered, creating an atmosphere of death that permeated everything. Fear was constant, but so was determination to complete the mission. Being young and 4,000 miles from home, anyone would have been scared, but the job had to be done regardless of fear. The physical demands of Red Ball operations were absolutely relentless and ground down even the strongest men. Roads damaged by recent combat and deteriorating weather conditions created brutal driving experiences. Hitting potholes at high speed threw drivers violently against the cab ceilings, creating a constant barrage of bruises and minor injuries. Tire failures occurred with disheartening frequency, requiring hasty roadside changes under enormous pressure to catch up with convoys that had continued forward. Mud became perhaps the most persistent operational challenge, turning unpaved road sections into quagmires that bogged down vehicles and slowed entire convoys to crawling speeds. Washington Rector, who served with the 3,916th Quartermaster Truck Company, later recalled the discrimination that persisted even during this critical operation when national survival should have erased such artificial divisions. Discrimination was simply something you accepted, he explained, noting that black drivers were explicitly warned against fraternizing with white personnel for fear that problems would arise. One veteran remembered a particularly telling incident where an African-American unit attempted to pass a white convoy on the highway, only to have white drivers deliberately whiplash their trucks into the center of the roadway to prevent black drivers from passing, creating a dangerous game of chicken on roads where speed meant the difference between success and failure. Yet despite facing discrimination, crushing exhaustion, and genuine danger from both enemy action and hazardous conditions, Red Ball drivers maintained the operations that kept Allied armies advancing across France. On August 29th, the system reached its absolute peak capacity, with 5,938 vehicles delivering 1,342 tons of supplies in a single 24-hour period. This represented more tonnage than Germany's entire logistics system operating in France could move through all methods combined, including truck, rail, and horse-drawn transport, on their very best day of operations. The scale of this achievement becomes truly comprehensible only through direct comparison with enemy capabilities. At any given moment during peak operations, approximately 900 trucks were actively on the road, with roughly 2,000 trucks moving loaded toward the front, another 2,000 returning empty to Normandy, and the remainder undergoing loading, unloading, refueling, or necessary maintenance. The system processed over 6,000 individual vehicle movements daily while maintaining continuous operations without pause, creating what amounted to the world's busiest highway network operating under wartime conditions. Sustaining the Red Ball Express itself required truly massive resources that represented a significant logistical challenge separate from the main mission. 6,000 trucks consumed approximately 2 million gallons of gasoline monthly just to operate, entirely separate from the fuel they transported forward to combat units. Tire wear resulting from continuous operations at high speeds on damaged roads exhausted approximately 50,000 tires during the 83 days that Red Ball operated. Maintenance requirements meant that approximately 10% of the entire fleet was disabled for repairs at any given time, requiring constant rotation of vehicles to maintain operational capacity. The logistical infrastructure supporting this logistics operation involved establishing refueling points along the entire route, creating maintenance depots staffed with skilled mechanics, and manning traffic control stations at every critical junction. Repair crews had to be strategically positioned to respond quickly to the inevitable breakdowns, while spare parts needed to be distributed efficiently to all maintenance points along hundreds of miles of highway. All of this meta-logistics had to function smoothly and efficiently, while the primary mission of moving combat supplies forward continued without the slightest interruption. For German forces attempting to mount some form of coherent defense against the Allied advance, American logistics capabilities created problems that simply had no solution within their doctrinal framework. Traditional German defensive doctrine, based on decades of military theory and practical experience, assumed that attacking forces would inevitably outrun their supply lines at some point, creating vulnerable pauses during resupply operations that defenders could exploit through well-timed counterattacks. American logistics systematically eliminated these opportunities through sheer capacity and organizational efficiency. German military logistics in 1944 relied extraordinarily heavily on horse-drawn transport in ways that shocked Allied observers when they finally understood the full extent of German dependence on animal power. Germany had entered the war with approximately 2,750,000 horses, and Wehrmacht dependence on these animals actually increased substantially as the war progressed, and motor vehicle losses exceeded the industrial capacity to replace them. This forced German divisions to rely ever more heavily on horse-drawn wagons, even as Allied forces became increasingly motorized and mechanized. A typical German infantry division operating in France during 1944 included approximately 50 motorized vehicles of various types and capacities, but also required 1,500 horse-drawn wagons pulled by anywhere from 4,000 to 6,000 horses. These animals required 12 pounds of oats and 15 pounds of hay every single day, plus constant access to water for drinking and cooling. During offensive operations, horses could move approximately 15 to 20 miles per day before requiring rest, fundamentally limiting the operational tempo of any unit dependent on them. The logistics involved in simply feeding these horses consumed enormous resources that could otherwise have supported combat operations directly. German supply columns consisting of 40 horse-drawn wagons and perhaps a dozen trucks of various makes and models could move approximately 40 tons of supplies forward about 20 kilometers on good roads under favorable conditions. This operation required feeding 160 horses and maintaining trucks that shared no common spare parts because Germany's fragmented industrial base had produced dozens of different vehicle models without standardization. By direct comparison, a single Red Ball Express convoy of 25 identical trucks could move 125 tons of supplies 200 kilometers in the same time period that German forces needed to move 40 tons 20 kilometers forward. This 10-to-1 advantage in logistics capacity gave American forces operational capabilities that German commanders simply could not match through any amount of tactical skill or battlefield courage. German attempts to interdict Red Ball operations and disrupt the flow of supplies achieved minimal success despite determined efforts. Luftwaffe attacks, once feared as the primary threat to convoy operations, proved almost completely ineffective as German air power collapsed under sustained Allied fighter superiority and chronic fuel shortages. By September of 1944, Luftwaffe sorties over France had become so rare that Red Bull convoys operated without dedicated fighter escort and suffered negligible losses to air attack throughout their operations. Ground interdiction attempts by German forces proved equally futile in disrupting the constant flow of supplies. German units that attempted to ambush convoys or establish roadblocks found themselves quickly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of traffic and the armed escort vehicles that accompanied the truck columns. Engineer units worked constantly to repair bridges, fill craters, and generally keep routes passable despite German demolition efforts. Despite facing these challenges, along with mechanical breakdowns, driver exhaustion, and increasingly difficult weather as autumn approached, the Red Ball Express delivered between 412,000 and 420,000 tons of supplies between August 25th and November 16th of 1944. Different sources provide varying figures for the exact total tonnage, but all agree that the achievement was extraordinary. This represented over 1 million individual truckloads, moved an average distance of 250 miles through weather conditions, mechanical challenges, and operational demands that would have shattered any less resilient logistics system. The operational scope expanded steadily beyond the original route as Allied forces continued their advance across France and into Belgium. By September, multiple express routes were operating simultaneously across liberated France, each with distinctive visual markings, but all following the same basic operational principles established by the original Red Ball system. The White Ball Express operated from Le Havre and Rouen northward to Paris starting in early October, while the Little Red Ball carried priority supplies from Normandy directly to the French capital. The Green Diamond Express moved supplies from Normandy to railheads approximately 100 miles inland, and the Red Lion Express supplied British 21st Army Group forces operating in Belgium. The ABC Express route connected the crucial port of Antwerp to supply depots 90 miles inland after that vital facility opened to shipping in November. These interconnected express routes created a transportation network operating almost entirely independently of rail infrastructure, providing a flexibility that traditional logistics systems bound to railway lines simply could not match. When German counterattacks severed rail lines, truck convoys could reroute within hours to avoid the disruption. When ports became congested with too many ships waiting to unload, supplies could be seamlessly shifted to alternate routes without significant delay. The American logistics system demonstrated remarkable resilience through its built-in redundancy and adaptability to changing circumstances. The Red Ball Express officially ceased operations on November 16th, primarily because by that date, French rail lines had been sufficiently repaired to resume moving significant quantities of supplies forward. More significantly, the port of Antwerp in Belgium had been captured intact by Allied forces on September 4th, and was fully opened to shipping operations by late November, after Allied forces finally cleared stubborn German defenders from the Scheldt estuary that controlled access to the port. Antwerp's deep-water port facilities possessed the capacity to handle far more tonnage than the Normandy beaches and the Mulberry harbours combined, while also dramatically shortening supply lines to forward units by hundreds of miles. As Red Ball operations wound down in response to these changed circumstances, daily tonnage delivered decreased accordingly in a planned reduction. From the peak of 12,342 tons delivered on August 29th, daily deliveries settled to approximately 5,000 tons through October, then declined further to around 2,700 tons daily in early November. By mid-November, only 5 truck companies remained operating on Red Ball routes compared to the 132 companies that had been deployed at peak operations in early September. The cost of this extraordinary achievement was measured most directly in exhausted personnel and worn-out equipment that had been pushed far beyond normal operational parameters. Maintenance records indicate that Red Ball trucks required major repairs approximately every 30 days of continuous operations under these demanding conditions, as the extreme operational tempo wore out mechanical components far faster than normal peacetime usage would have done. Personnel casualties from traffic accidents, sheer exhaustion, and the relatively few enemy encounters that occurred totaled several hundred men, though exact figures remain unclear due to incomplete record-keeping under intense operational pressures. Yet even this significant cost was minimal when compared to the strategic value that Red Ball delivered to the Allied campaign. The operation enabled Allied forces to maintain relentless pressure on retreating German armies at precisely the moment when sustained pursuit might have ended the war months earlier than it actually concluded. Although fuel shortages eventually forced operational pauses in September that allowed German forces to establish new defensive lines, the sustained offensive pressure from August through early October inflicted irreplaceable losses on German units and brought Allied armies directly to Germany's western frontier. Military historians continue debating even today whether different logistics priorities and resource allocation decisions might have enabled Allied forces to breach Germany's West Wall defences during autumn of 1944, potentially ending the war before winter set in and before German forces could establish coherent defensive lines. These counterfactual discussions often centre on fuel allocation decisions, with some historians arguing forcefully that concentrating all available resources on a single thrust, whether Field Marshal Montgomery's northern route or General Patton's southern advance, might have achieved the decisive breakthrough that the broad front strategy ultimately prevented. These intellectual debates, while fascinating exercises in alternative history, sometimes overlook or minimize the fundamental achievement that Red Ball represented, regardless of what might have been possible with different strategic choices. The system successfully delivered sufficient supplies to support simultaneous offensive operations across a front measuring over 400 kilometers in width, while maintaining the operational flexibility that allowed rapid response to changing tactical situations and shifting priorities. No previous army in all of military history had sustained such massive operations at such distances from secure supply bases using only road transport without significant rail support. The racial composition of Red Ball units reflected America's segregated military structure, while simultaneously undermining the racist assumptions that had created and sustained that segregation in the first place. African American soldiers served their nation with distinction, despite facing systematic discrimination both at home in civilian society and within the very military structure they served. Their outstanding performance during Red Ball Express operations demonstrated capabilities that racial prejudice falsely claimed they lacked, providing concrete evidence against segregationist arguments. 3/4 of Red Ball drivers were black soldiers who had been assigned to non-combat service units not because of any lack of ability, courage, or competence, but purely because military leadership in 1944 maintained rigid racial restrictions on combat roles based on nothing more than prejudice. These men proved their courage, demonstrated their competence, and maintained their dedication under conditions as demanding and dangerous as those faced by any combat troops at the front. They drove through enemy-controlled territory, operated under fire when German units attempted interdiction of supply routes, and maintained their operational discipline despite exhaustion that would have broken less determined individuals or units with lower morale. General George Patton, despite harbouring his own well-documented racial prejudices that were typical of his era and social class, nonetheless acknowledged Red Bull's absolutely essential contribution to his Third Army's spectacular advance across France. He stated publicly that the 2.5-ton truck represented the most valuable weapon in his arsenal, recognition that was significant coming from an officer famous for his aggressive armoured tactics. Colonel John Eisenhower, son of Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower and himself a serving officer, argued persuasively after the war that without the contributions of Red Bull truck drivers, the rapid advance across France simply could not have been accomplished, as traditional logistics would have forced frequent operational pauses. Following the war's conclusion, African-American Red Bull drivers returned to a segregated America that had changed remarkably little during their absence despite their contributions to victory. Many of these veterans faced continued discrimination and limited opportunities despite their honorable service to the nation. Yet their collective achievement contributed significantly to the growing pressure for military integration that would eventually transform American armed forces. The demonstrated performance of black soldiers in logistics roles and in the combat positions that some eventually occupied during the desperate fighting of the Battle of the Bulge, when manpower shortages forced temporary integration, helped demonstrate the complete absurdity of racial segregation from both moral and practical standpoints. President Harry Truman's 1948 executive order officially integrating the armed forces drew partly on the accumulated evidence that racial segregation actively harmed military effectiveness, rather than enhancing it as segregationists had long claimed. Red Bull drivers recognized the fundamental contradiction of their situation even while operations were ongoing. They were serving a nation that denied them full citizenship rights and subjected them to systematic discrimination, delivering supplies to armies fighting for freedom and democracy abroad, while they themselves faced racism at home. The Double V campaign promoted by black newspapers throughout the war, calling for victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home, resonated deeply with Red Bull soldiers who embodied this dual struggle in their daily service. In September of 1985, 41 years after Red Bull operations began, surviving drivers held an emotional reunion in Alexandria, Virginia, bringing together men who had shared one of the war's most demanding experiences. Over 500 former drivers attended along with their families, gathering to share memories of their service and ensure that younger generations understood their contributions. Former Corporal Charles Johnson, who had served with the 783rd Military Police Battalion, directing Red Bull traffic at critical intersections, spoke movingly at the reunion about the significance of their collective contribution to victory. The drivers had moved over 400,000 tons of supplies in 83 days of continuous operations, keeping multiple armies advancing when conventional logistics wisdom insisted that supply chains must inevitably fail under such strain. The operational lessons learned from Red Bull influenced American military logistics thinking and doctrine for decades following the war's conclusion. Similar dedicated supply routes appeared during the Korean War, though necessarily on a smaller scale given the different geography and strategic situation. Vietnam logistics operations adapted Red Bull principles to Southeast Asian conditions, with routes like Route 19 becoming vital supply arteries despite constant communist interdiction attempts. Desert Storm planners in 1991 studied Red Bull operations carefully when developing the supply systems that would sustain the liberation of Kuwait, recognizing that the principles remained valid even in a completely different operational environment. Modern American military doctrine places enormous emphasis on logistics flexibility, built-in redundancy, and the capacity to sustain high operational tempo through superior supply chain management. These fundamental principles trace directly to lessons learned during Red Bull and the broader logistics achievements that sustained Allied operations throughout World War II. The concept of theatre sustainment command structures, centralised logistics planning coordinating multiple services and national forces, and joint logistics operations conducted across service boundaries all evolved from wartime experiences, including Red Bull's innovative approaches. General Dwight Eisenhower, speaking after the war with the perspective of someone who had commanded the largest military coalition in history, included the 2.5-ton truck on his personal list of the 6 most vital weapons systems that won the war in Europe. The other 5 items on his list included the Dakota C-47 transport aircraft that enabled airborne operations and aerial resupply, the Jeep that provided unprecedented tactical mobility, the bazooka that gave infantry units effective anti-tank capability, the atomic bomb that ended the Pacific War, and the humble bulldozer that proved essential for everything from building airfields to clearing battlefield obstacles. This assessment from the Supreme Allied Commander, who had direct access to every weapons system in the Allied arsenal and understood their relative contributions intimately, underscores the absolutely strategic importance of logistics in modern warfare. The raw statistics of Red Ball operations remain genuinely impressive by any standard, even when evaluated from our modern perspective with its advanced logistics systems. 83 days of continuous operations delivering an average of 5,000 tons daily represents sustained logistics performance,